and welcome to the special virtual study session of the Southline Community Schools Board of Education at 6:04 on January 13th. Ms. Ertel, would you be so kind as to call the roll for attendance for us, please?
Yes. Mr. Kennedy.
I'm here.
Mr. Dashner.
I am here.
Ms. McDowell.
Here.
I'm here. Mr. Leftwich.
I am here.
And am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay, good. Mr. Abate.
He just sent me a message. He is on his way.
Okay. And Mr. Schwegler.
Here.
Right,
So we have 6 present, 1 on the way.
Yep. So we have a quorum. Let's get started. Item number 3 is the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And justice for all. The next item on our agenda is public comments. Mr. Russell, did you make a new spreadsheet for this evening? If I log into it, I don't see anything on the website on the spreadsheet for public comments.
I apologize. Is everything else crossed out?
The link from last time, there's nothing on that one. So it looks like Chester deleted those earlier today.
So it's the same link. So if there's not currently any comments in there, that's probably why.
Okay. Yep. There's nothing in there. So we'll move on to the background on our district's benchmark assessments. I'm not sure if Mr. Archibald or Ms. Kudwa or Ms. Weber is going to lead on that, or Ms. Engblom. One of you will start. So whoever's going to start, feel free to go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to lead off and then get out of the way and let the folks from our Cedar Department talk. But just a quick introduction is required under the extended continuity of learning legislation. We'll be sharing information from our fall administration of the district's benchmark assessment, which is the NWEA MAP growth. And we have to provide that information prior to February 1st. It is on the agenda in terms of the assessment data to be presented at next Tuesday's meeting. But we felt that it would be beneficial to hold this brief study session prior to that meeting to provide a little bit of information to hopefully provide some context around the testing that might make the sharing of the data next week a little more relevant. So tonight, again, we have a short presentation for you, which provides a quick overview of the legislative mandate with regard to the benchmark assessments for this school year. Some background, and as those of you who have been with the district know that we have a history of using the NWE MAP growth assessment in the district, and we'll share a little bit of that background. A short overview on the assessment itself, and then closing with how that information is used, how that data is used within our schools and at the district level to guide instruction and instructional decision making. So the board, if you would, these are intended to be a little bit more informal meetings. So certainly if you have questions as we go, you should feel free to ask. You have I think the raise hand feature on your screen, and then someone will call on you. I didn't mean for that to sound condescending if it did, but if you again use that feature and we'll call on you and try to keep the conversation going, but don't hesitate to raise a hand to ask questions as we go. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Kudwa and our friends from CEDA.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to speak a little bit to the legislative assessment mandates that came out earlier in the year. I can't tell if it's Jeff or Chester. If I could get the next, you can skip ahead past the, there we go. So again, a law was passed in August that requires us to do a couple of things as far as setting educational goals for the district for the year related to the pandemic. So related to that, we had to make sure we had a benchmark or benchmark assessment system that was aligned to the state standards, and we needed to make sure students were making meaningful progress toward mastery of those state standards. And then the assessment did need to be administered to all students in grades K through 8. And as you'll see, we did choose to administer that assessment to grades beyond that as well too. And we needed to make sure that happened within the first 9 weeks of the school year and again before the end of the school year. And we did opt to do a mid-year assessment in most areas as well too. And we needed to make sure that assessment was given in reading and mathematics. In South Lyon, we do have 3 test windows that we used. We had from September to early November. And then in winter, it's grades K through 8 only. We are using January and February to do that testing. So we have our students back in the buildings now trying to get as much of that in as we can while they are in person. And then in spring, we will be assessing from April to May. And we have had to adjust those slightly as we've had students going out for quarantines and coming back in. So the testing windows are definitely a little bit lengthier this year than they would be in a typical school year. And it is important to note, we had already planned to give this administration for grades K through 10. We did add in 11 and 12 with CARES funds as well too, but the plan had been to roll up to high school and include high school in our regular assessment system already. So the legislation for us did not mean a change in practice as far as what tests we were giving, but we did include 11 and 12 because there were funds to do so and we knew the data would be beneficial. As far as the next slide, please. As far as the return to learn legislation, so 2 progress reports are required. Our first one will be coming to you on Tuesday. So the first one must be done before February 1st, and the last one must be done before the end of the school year, so before our last day of school. We do post those after the board meetings to the transparency reporting page within the district's website, where we've been posting all of the extended continuity of learning information as well. And then the reports must be regarding achievement or growth for students in reading and math and in those aggregate and then subgroup areas. So we will be showing growth data within our district, not the achievement data, because that is what math growth is measuring. So we did set educational goals within our district. There are 2 of them. So the first is by the end of the 2021 school year, all of our students in K through 8, and again, the goals needed to address grades K through 8, will demonstrate growth in reading from fall to spring as measured by an increase in RIT score on the NWEA MAP growth reading assessment. And then the second goal was by the end of the 2021 school year, all of those students in K through 8 will demonstrate growth in mathematics from fall to spring as measured by an increase in RIT score for the NWEA MAP growth math assessment. So those were the 2 that we set, but obviously we are using more than just those assessments. We're using classroom observation data, classroom data, common assessments that are occurring in the buildings to help us make judgments about those pieces as well too, so we can really make sure our students are growing as much as possible this school year. And Ms. England will speak to our district's background with using the MAP growth assessment.
Thank you. So we felt it would be helpful to provide a little bit of context about the history of the use of the assessment in our district and the decision that we had made about adopting the assessment a few years ago. So when we made the decision to adopt the MAP growth assessments, our district really already had a very strong history as a data-driven district. It was part of our culture. At the time, we already had common district-wide assessments that we were administering in all grades K-12. Those included some summative assessments like semester exams and also locally developed reading and math assessments that we were administering 2 times per year in grades 1 through 5. We also engaged in frequent cycles of data review. So the challenge whenever you have a behavior or a process or a system that your organization has been engaging in for an extended period of time is to always be sure that it doesn't become something that is purely compliance driven, but that it's something that is genuinely and authentically useful and helpful to continue to move instruction forward. So we really want staff to find value in the assessments that they are administering, and then really use those assessments to guide their instructional decision making. And so in order to live into that, it's important that we're regularly engaging in review cycles of our assessment system as well, to ensure that we have the data that we need to really inform instruction. Next slide, please. So the goal and guiding philosophy is that if we are taking instructional time to administer an assessment, then we want the information that we are receiving from that assessment to really help us make instructional decisions and maximize our instructional time with students. So as we're engaging in review of our assessment system, we do really focus on that return on investment of instructional time that I just mentioned. We also focus on ensuring that teachers have the information that they need about an assessment, its data, the information that they receive from the assessment, to really empower them as professional decision makers to help identify what students might need next instructionally. So this is an overview of the timeline of our process that really led to this kind of rolling adoption of the MAP growth assessments across our system. So the process began in the spring of 2017 at the elementary level, and we started the process by engaging in an assessment inventory with teachers. And the goals of that assessment inventory were to go through and identify the assessments that were already in use in our system and really name how they are used and the types of data and information that we get from each of those assessments. And then from there, identify gaps. You know, are there additional pieces of information that we wish that we were seeing or that would be more helpful in driving some of that instructional decision making? So during that assessment inventory process, and then also the assessment review process that followed it, teachers were really impressed when it came to the MAP growth assessments with the level of reporting that's available within the assessment system. So teachers are able to access reports from the assessment after each administration, and then again over time, that really give them information like which standards or topics students are ready to learn next, and which pieces of information students may need some additional time or support with. There are reports within the system that assist with grouping students into small groups based on the information that they're ready to learn next. And the assessment also provides us with information about student growth relative to their achievement, which is a unique piece of data which shows us students who may be falling into a typically high achievement category. It enables us to look at their growth. So are they high achieving, but are we seeing that their growth is actually stalling out? Or do we have students who are falling into lower achievement categories, but they are showing accelerated growth over time? Or do we have concerns about the growth that they're making? So it enables us to look at multiple pieces of data or take multiple pieces of data into consideration when we're thinking about what might be most beneficial for a wide range of learners. So these reports are really helpful as we are working through support processes for students and then really considering what they need next to continue to support their growth. So you can see, actually, could you go back to that slide thank you, sorry. So you can see that as we implemented these assessments at the elementary level, we were sharing information about the assessment itself and the reports that are available in the assessment and the types of data that are available in the assessment with teachers at the next set of grade bands. So we were sharing that information with middle school teachers as we were implementing at elementary school to really help them understand the data that they would be receiving, that they would be seeing for students that they would be receiving the following school year. And so like at the elementary level, given the information that we were providing about the assessment, middle school teachers also recommended a pilot then for the following school year for middle school. And then you can see that we fell into a similar pattern with high school as well, with 9th grade teachers then making that recommendation to pilot for the fall of the 2021 school year. As Mrs. Kudwa mentioned earlier, the grade levels that did not follow that specific sequence for teacher recommendation for adoption were those 10th through 12th grades. And so for those grade levels, knowing that the typical instructional sequence of the school year was interrupted in the spring, we really felt that it would be helpful to have that norm referenced data at the beginning of the school year to help guide our decision making for those students this fall, which is why we opted to administer for those students in the fall as well. Next slide, please. So again, as you know, teacher empowerment as instructional decision makers was at the core of a lot of these decisions that we were making related to our assessment system. We developed a layered professional learning structure. So we knew that we needed to really have a robust professional learning around the assessment itself if we really wanted teachers to feel like they were able to use the information that came from the assessment. So we had a layered professional learning structure that began with NWEA facilitated sessions for building leadership teams. And then those sessions involved time for those leadership teams to then develop professional learning that they would use to share information at the building level. And then from there, we also spent time focusing on data dig sessions for grade levels and for departments so that those teachers were able to really dig in the context of their own reports and get to learn the reports that way as well. So this is an overview of our professional learning structure, and you'll see that we really engaged in a two-year professional learning cycle for each grade band's implementation. So at the beginning of the year, we really focused on providing teachers with the information that they needed for that initial assessment administration so that teachers felt comfortable and confident administering the assessment. Then once we actually had data in the system that teachers were able to go in and see data for their own learners, then we really focused on some of the specific reports in the assessment that were most beneficial at that point in the year. That's one of the beauties about the assessment system is that as you collect multiple data points over time, there are more robust reports that you're able to access. You're able to layer in the information about the growth as you go. So in the fall, we really focused on just sort of that initial administration. What are you able to see from this first testing cycle? And then in February, we layered on the pieces that start to explore more of the student growth and talked about what information does that give us about the students as learners that will help us to inform the next steps instructionally. In the second year of implementation, we always try to focus on if there are any updates to the assessment system itself so that teachers feel prepared to go into the fall on that next administration. And then again, now that there's additional data in the system and as teachers are more comfortable accessing the different reports and knowing what each of the different reports mean, starting to look sort of over time at some of that growth data. And again, what can that tell us about instruction? And then we really, in that second year, start helping to look at the building level trends so that we're able to look sort of more globally about the information that we're receiving from the assessment too. So I spoke earlier about how our adoption began with assessment system analysis. So it's not a one-time thing. It's really this continued assessment system analysis that we engage in that helps us, again, to ensure that the data, that the information that we're receiving is robust and that we have the information that we need from the assessments that we're giving. So through what we also made sure to do was to layer into that ongoing professional learning, continued work around our assessment system and continuously looking at what pieces of information are we receiving from each of the different assessments that we administer. So as we continued that professional learning, we really recognized the importance of helping teachers understand how the MAP growth assessment is different from typical summative district assessments, how the information that we receive from this assessment fits into the larger picture of all of the other pieces of information that we have about a student. Also, as a result of that ongoing assessment system analysis, teachers continue to identify assessments administered and really focus on naming their purpose and the role that they serve for instruction. And it was through that process that leadership teams at the secondary level have begun to make some recommendations about changing the district assessment structure so that the locally developed assessments are, we're really focusing there on developing smaller data checkpoint assessments that provide actionable data to help guide instruction. So for example, there was the recommendation to eliminate the semester exams at the middle school level and replace those with these common locally developed data checkpoints that can be done at various points over the course of the year to help teachers in the moment guide instruction, adjust instruction, and ensure that students are receiving the support that they need. So in terms of next steps overall for our assessment system, again, we are in the process of developing some of those data checkpoint assessments for use in the upcoming school years. Initially, back in the last winter, that was one of the things that was going to be one of the primary areas of focus for us this year. That is something that we plan on picking up again as we're moving forward. Also continuing to help building teams analyze the data that they receive from the assessment. Again, because a part of what we are doing in all of this is continuously reviewing our assessment system, we also realize the importance of ensuring that we're continuing to communicate out, why we are administering each assessment, what information we get from each assessment, and how that helps us to create a more robust picture of students as overall as learners. And then one of our primary areas of focus as we're continuing to move forward is, of course, analyzing the data from each of the administrations over the course of this school year so that we're able to determine next steps for students, next steps in terms of professional learning or supports for teachers, and then next steps for programs. Ms. McDowell?
I forgot to unmute. Could you go back to the next slide? Because my question was about that slide. Or go back to the previous slide, not go back to the next. That doesn't make sense.
The next steps?
Yes.
Okay.
I still don't see it.
I think,
there
yes,
it is.
that one.
So on this next steps, like you're at developing the checkpoint assessments, right? Like that is the stop. And then obviously with March, that's where things paused, right?
Correct. So that was one of the things that we had really identified as a primary area of focus. And then, like you said, once March came, we had to pause in that work, but that will be work that we are picking up again.
And so just so I understand, are these meant to be like common checkpoint assessments for math and ELA for grades like, did you say it was middle grades or high school?
So really, this is something I think that we are looking at within our K-8 system, are really looking at developing, one of the things that we had with some of our locally developed assessments is that many of them were very lengthy. And often came at the very end of an instructional cycle. And so the goal that what we're focusing on there really for K-8 is to look at what smaller pieces of information do we need along the way and developing those common checkpoint assessments. And again, that was really K-8. And we were actually looking at that within math, ELA, science, and social studies.
And if you're not at this point, that's totally fine. But like, what kind of, who's going to be developing them and what kind of training are they going to get in item writing and test development?
So these would be developed by our subject area curriculum committees. So those are those groups of teachers from each of the buildings across the district, from each of the grade levels. We have representatives from all grade levels and from each of the buildings across the district who participate. And they are really focused on developing those assessment checkpoints. So truthfully, what we will probably do once we begin in the fall again is sort of take an assessment of, not necessarily an assessment of those groups, but work with those groups to identify what professional learning they need in order to be able to do that. I think one of the things that we are anticipating might happen is that there may be some changes in terms of who is serving on those committees. So we would want to make sure that whatever professional learning we're developing for them or we're providing to them based on that really fits the needs of the people who are on the committees at that moment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I would just add that the Michigan Assessment Consortium has really amazing trainings and even like micro-credentialing available for district level staff and classroom teachers.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, what I've shared so far? So really, this slide is just a really quick kind of snapshot overview of some of the key reasons that we've elected to utilize the NWEA MAP growth assessments within our assessment system. So these assessments also have predictors of success on MSTEP, PSAT, and SAT. So the NWEA organization does correlative studies where they go through and look at student success rates on those state and national standardized assessments and the correlation between how students perform on the MAP growth assessments. And so it provides us with some information about students who, based on their performance on MAP growth, are most likely on track to be successful on some of those other state and national standardized assessments. It provides an additional data source to really help us triangulate with our local assessment data and, again, some of those other standardized testing pieces. It does provide us with nationally normed data, and then it gives us those powerful reports that really help to inform decision-making on IEPs, student support plans, and really just day-to-day classroom instructional decision-making and unit planning as well. And Mrs. Weber is going to be sharing some additional information about the assessment itself.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what the assessment experience is like for both students and teachers. So each student is going to have a unique test when they log into MAP Growth. They're going to have a varying number of questions in each subject area. We tested in math and reading this fall in particular. And those questions are computer adaptive. So what that means is the test is going to adjust to the student instructional level as that test progresses for that student. When we get to that instructional level, students can expect to get about 50% of the questions incorrect or 50% correct, however you want to look at it. And that gives us that zone of proximal development for a student. On our K1 assessment, it's a little bit different than the rest of the assessments for NWEA MAP growth, but that test is read to students and it's constructed in a way that's very age appropriate for those learners. It's almost more of like a game for them to go through the assessment, so it's engaging for them and works with their age and their developmental level. The other thing on the teacher side, as far as the assessment experience is concerned, teachers get that class level data within 24 hours of students taking the assessment. So it's a very quick turnaround for teachers to get those data points back to be able to start making classroom decisions. One thing I do want to note there is that district level data, though, is not available to us until we close our district window. So that often happens after, well, it does happen after everyone in the district has tested and we're able to close that window and process those reports. So within the assessment, student scores are shown as RIT scores. So a RIT score is a Roche unit scale. And what that is it's used to measure and compare academic growth. That scale extends equally across grade levels. So we're able to compare students who are even not in the same grade level. And it represents the level at which a student is ready to learn. So again, that's that zone of proximal development. Students are going to get an overall score in reading and math, but they also get sub-goal scores in each of those subject areas. One thing I do want to note, though, is that student growth can only be shown over time. So right now we have one administration for this fall. So when we present data next week, we don't have growth data yet for this year. So we just want to make sure that the board is aware of that. And the most reliable time for us to get that growth data is to look from fall to spring over a school year, to look at the growth of that student throughout a school year. So the board will be updated again later towards the end of the school year once we finish that spring administration to show that growth of our students over time. Another part of that assessment is percentiles. So what we will see is part of that student score has a percentile rank, which shows how a student compares to grade level peers across the country who have received the same number of weeks of instruction at the time the assessment is administered. And then the other thing is that this is a nationally normed test. So the norms for this assessment are updated every 5 years, and they use millions of data points to update those norms. And this year, actually, there were new norms released for NWEA. Mr. Dashner, did you have a question?
Yeah, understanding that you can't get growth now because there's only the one test in the fall, can it be compared to tests taken in previous years to get growth, call it from last fall to this fall? And are we planning on looking at that?
We can show fall to fall. We do want to caution, though, that that is not the most reliable measure. And there's a lot of things that we have to consider that are unique, especially to this year from fall to fall, if we were looking at those data points.
Well,
but yes, we can show that.
Part of why I'm asking is I'm guessing parents are going to be interested in how far did kids slide with what went on in the spring and what's happening now. And I'm assuming that would be somewhat of a measure of it.
It is, but to be honest, it's probably not what you would expect it to look like. They're
that's fine.
Yeah, it's just not the most reliable measure to go from a fall to a fall. It's much better to look within a school year at that growth. Mrs. McDowell?
Yeah, does the map also report out like a Lexile measure for students in reading?
It does. Yes, it does measure the Lexile level of a student. It gives a range actually for the students, which help teachers also to find those, just right books for students at their instructional level. Any other questions on this one? Next slide, please. So the next step in that process is, what do we do with that data once we get it? So this data does help us build supports and tailor instruction for students to help move them forward with academic progress. Things like weekly support time for students and small group instruction are things that we use with this data to help move our students forward. And just, as a reminder, and we've said this already before, but this is only one of those pieces of data that we use to inform system-wide decisions on curriculum and instruction. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So I will open it up for questions.
I'd just like to say thank you for it. I already asked my questions because Steve encouraged us to interrupt, so nothing
You are
additional.
welcome.
And I want to thank Kristen, Kelly, and Lisa for providing the background. I think certainly as we continue the work and share data throughout the remainder of the year, I think it's valuable for us to have a common understanding and context for the information, and will hopefully lead to some good discussion when we get to sharing that as well. I'll pause for a second in case there are any other questions.
I guess I only had a quick comment just to make sure that my head is remembering the history correctly. We started with this particular assessment model about a year and a half ago. Or we were
2017 was when we started the process.
Okay. Um,
So, Mr. Kennedy, you may be remembering, that's when it was implemented in middle school, and then we did have a big discussion at several board meetings because it had an impact on the semester assessment process that we
Right.
were previously using. So my guess is that's the timeline that you're recalling.
I believe so, yeah. Using this model gives, if I could say it in one sentence, much, much more usable data, much, much quicker with less time testing in the school year. I think those are the three key points that anybody at home who would dig this meeting up and watch it and wonder what this is. If I remember, those were the three, I hate to say selling points, but the three advantages of using this system. I think it's worthy noting that um, that those were the goals and that was the premise for using this model back in the day, if I could use that term, when we first looked at it and we're talking about it.
All right.
That's all I have, other than thanks all.
I think that concludes the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Kennedy to close out the meeting.
Sure. Number 5 on our agenda is public comments, and I'm not sure that when I hopped on the stream real quick that I saw anybody other than the 15 of us, maybe 4 people streaming, but there's no comments on my list. So with that, we can move to item number 6, which would be an adjournment.
I'll move to adjourn.
Support.
Motion to adjourn by Mr. Dashner, supported by Ms. Ertel. Since Mr. Bate has arrived, welcome. Would you mind calling the roll for this vote?
I would be happy to, and I apologize for the tardiness. I'm still adjusting to a new normal here. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very good, very informative. And I will, I'll call the roll. Mr. Kennedy.
I vote yes.
I also vote yes. Mr.
Yes.
Dashner. Mr. Schwegler.
Yes.
Mrs. Ertel.
Yes.
Mrs. McDowell.
Yes.
And Mr. Lefwich.
Yes.
Motion to adjourn passes 7-0. We stand adjourned at 6:41. Thank you all very much for your time this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and good night, everyone.
Good night.